Okay, welcome to the first presentation of our McGoy Summer Workshop webinar series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land from where I'm speaking that is rich in the history and traditions of many First Nations and Métis, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This territory, governed by the Upper Canada Treaties, is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and adjacent to the Halderman Track. As gardeners, we gather on these treaty lands, recognizing our responsibility to honor, respect, and protect this land, its water, plants, and animals, and we acknowledge its traditional custodians. As we have had to cancel the summer workshop for a second season due to COVID-19, McGoy is excited to showcase 4 presentations in an online format starting tonight at 7 and continuing every Wednesday until September 15th. This technology offers our members access to the excellent instruction that is offered by the Niagara Parks School of Horticulture. Tonight, we feature Darrell Bley, who has been working and teaching horticulture for the past 37 years. Currently, he is the instructor and curator of the Woody Plant Collection at the Niagara Parks Botanical Gardens and School of Horticulture. He is responsible for everything related to woody plants. He also oversees the 3rd-year program that is related to internships, and that allows students to learn and study outside the grounds. He was presented the title of Outstanding Educator for the year 2020 after receiving many recommendations from former students, colleagues, and industry leaders. I'm very much looking forward to tonight's presentation titled Mutualism, the Key to Success, as I have been lucky to attend 2 of the summer workshops in the past and was most impressed with his knowledge and obvious passion for teaching. 2 of our members tonight are monitoring the chat, so during the presentation, I encourage you to enter any comments or questions that you have. Darrell will answer questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, here's Darrell.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And also I'd like to thank you for kind of definitely moving forward with this idea of online presentations. And, you know, it does give us an opportunity to connect with the Master Gardener members. And also it gives us an opportunity to learn along with you folks. And that's what I always encourage everybody, is to continue to learn from each other. And so when I do these presentations, that's definitely one thing that I'm doing, is I'm always learning something. And thank you to the panel that has been meeting behind the scenes and helping out. And that certainly makes my job, you know, nice and easy, and it runs smoothly. So I'd like to thank you for that. So I'm going to share my screen. And then maybe, Kate, if you could just give me a verbal yes that, you know, that's up and running.
Okay.
Yeah. And I should be sharing my screen now. Is that a go?
Yes, it's going.
All right. So we're going to focus on a presentation that is, you know, an hour and 15 minutes. I haven't done this presentation before, so it's a new presentation. So that pacing is sometimes, you know, something difficult to get exact, but that's kind of what we'll focus on. And I'd like to just kind of change that title. We're going to come back to the idea of mutualism a little bit later, but I want to just change that title to really relationships until we understand, you know, what mutualism is all about. So that's a good place to start. And the other thing to think about is that really sometimes it's complicated, but it really is not too complicated. And these relationships have happened over a long period of time. And they're sometimes fluid, but at the same time, it's kind of the same old song and dance from the participants, and that's important. And it's always, like the title says there, it's always interesting. So let's kind of just start, with looking at the word symbiotic or symbiosis. And a lot of our words that we use are Greek or Latin in origin, and it's together and living, and that kind of gives us that word symbiotic. And when we use that word, as we have many times, we always think about this relationship between two different things, two different biological entities that are kind of interacting. Both of them we can call a symbiote, and we need to have different species in order to really use that word correctly. So we have been using that word correctly for a long time, horticulturally, and also in other aspects of science. And we often use it when we talk about plants and mycorrhizae. It's a symbiotic relationship, and we describe that. We know it's important, and we know that definitely both entities are benefiting from each other, the plant and that fungal entity. And then we continue to use that word symbiosis, or that symbiotic relationship. But that word has been, I'm not saying controversial, but it's been under debate for a long period of time at the kind of scientific level. And it's, the debate is whether or not we should be using that word only when both parties benefit. But we've moved beyond that, and it's a much broader term. It's an umbrella term, and it encompasses many kind of underlying ideas, and that's kind of where we're going to go for a few minutes. What is that underlying idea? So what we want to realize is there's many words that we can attach in front of the word symbiosis, and obligatory is one of them. And in this situation, when we have obligatory symbiosis, it's really one species kind of depending on the other for its survival. And this is a good example. It's kind of a harsh example, but those Canadian lynx really need that hair in order to survive. But on the other side of that coin, when that hare population dramatically decreases, which it can do exceedingly suddenly, then that lynx population completely collapses as well. So it is a symbiotic relationship, and both species really rely on each other for its survival. So it's a good way to use both of those words. You can see that this type of symbiosis is defined a little differently, because here they benefit when they are together, but they can live quite well independently of each other. So we can see the aphids, we can have aphids all over the garden living independently and very successfully. Sans ants, which is French for without ants, I'm pretty sure that's proper French. And we know that ants also can survive very well without the aphids. So that is a slightly different type of symbiosis, but they benefit when they come together. So that umbrella idea of using the word symbiotic, we really can break it down a little bit more. And there's more than 5 types, but I just kind of focused on these 5, and you can kind of see that list there. One has to do with competition, the other has to do with predation. And we're going to spend a little bit of time with that term commensalism, and then move into the idea of parasites. And then we're going to focus on mutualism as our main focus for this presentation. So when we go to the word competitive symbiosis, what we need to realize is that both of these entities are kind of looking for the same resources. And they both give the other one the opportunity to gain access to the resource. So this battle between squirrel and bird has been going on for a long time, but they open the door for each other. They compete for the same food source. And that is a symbiotic relationship at the competitive level. Same example. They each benefit the other by opening the door for that opportunity. When we look at this picture here, we're thinking, why is this a picture of predation? How is that symbiotic? And in this case here, our herbivore is predating on the forbs and the grasses, but they're not getting rid of every forb and every grass. They are perhaps killing quite a few, but there's a balance there. The forbs can come back. They have the ability to multiply and to perpetuate and to be successful while that herbivore is predating on them. So we really are, in essence, we have a symbiotic relationship, but it's kind of at a predatory nature, but it works if that balance is there. The next term that we really have to focus on kind of talks about an opportunity for both entities to benefit, but maybe one doesn't realize it's benefiting the other. So commensalism is kind of an interesting thing. So we can see our monarch, we know that they're kind of starting their migratory flights and so forth, and we see that milkweed there, and we think, is that symbiosis? In essence, the milkweed really doesn't need that monarch. The monarch needs the milkweed. The milkweed is really unknowingly providing a relationship with the monarch, and it's benefiting the monarch. So it's a little bit different when it comes to the meaning of symbiosis versus mutualism, where they both kind of benefit. But that's an interesting idea. So we'll just kind of break that down a little bit further. This picture here is a picture of the spider that's benefiting by using that tree as its habitat. The tree is unwilling as a participant. Is it really benefiting? Most likely not too much. So the idea there is that one participant in a roundabout way is helping the other one. So an example, from the animal kingdom is when I have the northern caribou. It's looking for food in the winter, and it's always pawing through, trying to get through that snow cover to get at some lichens that are on the ground or perhaps on some low plant material. But it's also disturbing the soil. The soil may not be frozen underneath that good snow cover. It might be insulatory. And that Arctic fox is always close. It's not trying to annoy that caribou, but it's close by and it follows that. And it's benefiting because of what that caribou is doing. So the caribou is unwittingly, unknowingly, providing a nice relationship with that Arctic fox. And so often you'll always see these two in picture close to each other. And that's because they do form this kind of strange relationship where really this little fellow is the benefactor of what this large herbivore is doing. So that has to be broken down even a little bit further. And there's some kind of interesting words, and I practice pronouncing them. I don't have them all correct, but because these are some new words to me. I've seen them once in a while, but not to any great extent. And inquilinism is where one is using the other for a housing opportunity. So there's some little owls using that tree. So that's a symbiotic relationship. The tree doesn't know that it's benefiting the owls, but the owls are happy that the tree is doing what it's doing. If we look at this, and now we're back to the monarch and we're back to the Asclepius. So it's not really mutual symbiotic relationship, but in this case, the larva of the monarch is using the milkweed for its habitat during its whole larval period of time, which is, let's say 3 weeks. So again, the Asclepius is, is being predated on in essence, and this little fellow is using it for a habitat for a portion of its life cycle. So that's kind of interesting. Foracy is also part of that commensalism. And in this case, it's using others to transport itself. So it's got those great little hooks, the Velcro idea, and it's good at moving carefully. but skillfully and carefully to another location. So that's a relationship that's not mutualism, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And kind of at the bacteria level, we know about agrobacterium, and we know it loves the Rosaceae family, and we definitely know that that bacteria microbiota is really within the host organism, and it's benefiting from that. And in essence, the host isn't benefiting. So that's kind of commensalism at the fourth level, and that kind of leaves us to the next category of symbiosis, which is the idea of a parasite. And we see those pictures of mistletoe. You definitely have to go further south. We can find some mistletoe a little bit out in our boreal forest, kind of in the western part of Canada. But really, to see this type of mistletoe, we need to get down into that, below the mid. I would say, Mississippi, maybe the Carolinas. You can definitely see. You saw lots, when I was down in Alabama and stuff like that. It's all over the place in those trees, and that definitely is a parasite, and it's causing this tree to slowly die. The more mistletoes it gets on it, the weaker it becomes, and then maybe something else takes over from there. But that definitely is the idea. But now that brings us to where we want to talk about for the rest of our evening. That's idea of mutualism. And so now we can use that word. So we talked a little bit about symbiosis and relationships and so forth. But here we go, where both organisms are benefiting from each other. And so we're very good at thinking about lichens. We know that it's a combination of two things, a fungi and a nice algae. And both are benefiting the other by contributing to the overall common good of each other. And so that's a very good example, a simple example of really strong relationships when it comes to both benefiting. Therefore, we're going to use that word mutualism. And we can definitely see that, all over the place. It's a very common mutual association that we can have. I think it's always important to kind of look at what creates interest or what sparks an interest. And I like to do a lot of reading. And so I just put some titles up there. This is going to be recorded. If you can get back to the slide and kind of do some of this reading, I would say all of these books are easy peasy read. This was a wonderful book, Canadian author over here. Wonderful book over here, Canadian author here. Tim Flannery, an exceptional author and researcher. That's a heavy duty read. You got a strong pot of coffee and away you go. But it's pretty interesting stuff. And so I've read that a couple of times, actually, trying to digest it all. But it's an interesting book. And this is a wonderful book and kind of a compelling story. But there's lots of examples of mutualism related to the tiger and the Amur tiger in particular, and its very sad situation there in the borders of China and Russia. And then obviously a book exactly on our title called Mutualism. So these are some good books that you might want to grab a hold of. But let's kind of focus in on some examples here. So in this case, this is like a really pure example of mutualism. And some of the other ones that I'm going to present tonight, I'm not saying they're loosey-goosey, but they're broader brushstrokes. But this is a very narrow pencil idea here, where each picture is just pencil wide, because without each of these, both of them would not be here. So we need to look at yucca, and yucca alata is a new species, for me, and it's not something that I can say I can remember seeing anywhere, but we definitely have to get into the southern part of United States and into Mexico to see yucca alata. And yucca alata, like all yuccas, does produce an inflorescence that blooms over a fairly long period of time, like yucca does. And while it's doing that, it's being pollinated very specifically by this yucca moth. And the yucca moth is pollinating it, but it's also very specific, and it's laying its eggs very close to the ovary. And that little larva is going to burrow in, and it's going to burrow into the seed, the developing seed of yucca alata. And that's the only place that it'll survive, is in the seed of yucca alata. So there's enough seed that is being produced that allows that yucca still to produce an uneaten seed and perpetuate itself that way. Because remember, they don't flower, all the time. They have to wait a long time before they flower. So it's key that it produces enough seed to help it continue into the next generation. But that yucca moth is in there, always eating the seed, but also pollinating. So that's a very specific sharp pencil point mutual relationship between those two, and that's maybe a good place to start. So there's that little moth doing its magic, doing the pollination, and we know that inside our ovary wall here, we're going to be developing our seeds, and we can see that the larva of that moth, very specifically, it's the only place that it can reach its maturity is within those yucca seeds. So it's definitely tit for tat, but they're helping each other out, and both life cycle are such that the relationship is such that they can both continue their life cycle and move on. But we need to kind of, just before we go too far in, we need to go backwards a little bit. And this is our beautiful, prehistoric giant sloth that's extinct and certainly roamed, various parts of North America. And what we need to look at is why are we talking about this? We're talking about mutualism and this megatherium, a very, very large animal. And if there was a human standing beside it, a human, I don't think, would come higher than the thigh. This was a very, very large animal. And that sloth, which has been termed the Jefferson's ground sloth, was key to our buddy over here, where we see these little seeds and we see this very large mammal moving towards those seeds. That is what moved that seed. And that's what allowed this plant to be successful and to move forth into its environment and expand its territory. And so we also will look at this mastodon because it's doing the same thing to the same plant. And there's kind of a sad term here, and it's called an anachristic species. And anachristic species are a species that's lost its mutual partner. And so in both cases, the tree still exists, but we have lost their partners in crime that moved that seed from one place to the other, and basically through the digestive tract, process that seed so that little plants could come out, the back end of those, and little seeds could come out and be successful. So there's a very nice article here. And again, if we're recording this, I put some websites in here. You can visit that. That's a nice article. And it doesn't focus so much on our friend over here, the Jefferson ground sloth, but there's lots of reading to do. And just type in the keywords, obviously this animal and this plant. And that's kind of what we need to realize, that anachristic species is an historical mutual, and we can just keep adding some words to that. And that relationship is no longer in place. So we see this, large pod, and we can see the honey locust, very heavily thorned so that, that didn't get knocked over. But we also know those large animals had the ability to reach above those thorns and pick and pull out, those fruit that it would be very interested in, high protein fruit that it would be interested in eating, digesting, processing, and obviously dispelling those seeds. And when, I've mentioned this a few times. When I was in Kansas, I went to the Tall Grass Prairie Institute, and the amount of honey locusts in the gullies of the prairie, which was flat as a pancake, but the gullies obviously were, they were in the flat ground prairies. Water resources had made these gullies. The amount of thorned honey locusts, very scrubby trees. It was almost like you're in the savannas of Africa, very scrubby and just extremely thorned for that exact reason. So we knew that mastodon would have been moving through that area, that Jefferson ground sloths would have been moving through that area, and they would be definitely interested in that mega flora, the fruit of that mega flora. But the little round entities that we were looking at was our friend, the Osage orange. And we're capitalizing that O because that is an indigenous tribe, the Osage tribe. And we have that plant that once in a while we'll see a big specimen. We have a few big specimens here in Niagara, where I live. In Queenston, there's some very large specimens, maybe about this size. And what we really need to think about is this plant, you know, it's thorn for a reason, especially young ones, for the same reason. It takes maybe, we have it on the grounds, it took maybe 12 years to produce its first, you know, orange, so to speak. The fruit structure, which is an aggregate of drupes, actually. It's in the mulberry family, which has drupes. It's an aggregate of drupes. But it's thorn for a reason. It's thorn because it needs to get to a sexual maturity, and it can't afford to be predated on by herbivores like a mastodon or like that Jefferson's ground sloth. We want it to be a substantial tree. You know, think about the size of these animals that were eating that fruit. The other thing that it has, which is kind of an interesting thing, it's kind of an older feature in plants, is the idea of spurs, where we have several years of growth and then several leaves that are forming on from one location, where you can afford to be browsed upon, but you may not lose, you know, all the leaves from that one browsed location. So a lot of gymnosperms, which are quite old, you know, in that kind of cladastic diagram of age of plants, and are also heavily spurred. And so that's kind of an interesting feature as well, that you can start to think that it's being predated upon by something. So what's interesting is Maclura palmifera, if we look at its native range, you can see we got Texas over here, right? And it's a southern plant. And that's sometimes when we see a native range map of Maclura, we'll definitely see, you know, what looks like this dog bone here, but we'll see an outside zone. And I tried to find that map, you know, and I've used it in some lectures. I looked through a lot of lectures to find it. I couldn't, but sometimes you'll find a pink outer zone. I found something similar that I'll look at in a second. But what we're trying to say is that Maclura, this is its range, and its range shrank dramatically when those mega fauna were brought to extinction for various reasons. And so what we want, you know, what we want to say is, you know, it can produce fruit, but if there's nothing to carry that developing fruit with its aggregate of drupes, there's nothing to carry those seeds, its habitat is going to shrink, kind of right back to its core where it started. And that's kind of what's been happening with Maclura. When we look at its true native range, it's shrinking. We're moving it, and we're moving it. This is a US map. I couldn't find one for Canada, but we see it in Canada here, kind of, you know, definitely around that particular latitude. But what we need to realize is it's like a baton race, and we've been given the baton, as well as I would say split-hoofed animals. So maybe horses as well, which aren't split-hoofed, but, you know, goats and cattle and so forth have kind of taken up that task of assisting that Maclura in its mobility. So the baton's been handed from a couple of these, you know, prehistoric creatures to us, and we have expanded that range when really that range is kind of down in here. And so other people and other animals have kind of stepped up to the plate. So we're part of that mutualism. I hope we are anyways, if we want to see this plant continue to expand in its territory. And it's kind of a nice, interesting plant, right? And that's kind of a good picture. And that definitely doesn't look like a split-hoofed animal like a cow, but I think that's a horse, and it's doing its magic on that. And we can see very often, we see historical hedgerows where we use this plant as a hedge to keep livestock in. And, you know, once it came to a sexual age, this plant could produce even in a hedge, and that helps then to provide a food source for those animals that move it around. So that's kind of interesting. And hope, you know, we've in Niagara here, we have about 6 of these hedgerows that I know of, and perhaps in your area you can see a Maclura hedgerow as well. They're kind of, you know, something that people are trying to protect and preserve, and that would be an example of one of these historical hedgerows over here. So on the same topic, so we can kind of move on, we know that besides our friend Gladitsia, and our friend the Osage orange Kentucky coffee tree is exactly all part of that. So it's an anachronistic species as well. And those big seed pods were there because the mega fauna were huge, and it needed a very tough seed coat, to survive that onslaught of those large predaceous herbivores. And we don't think of Kentucky coffee tree, we don't think of Osage orange, and we don't really think of our friend the Gladitsia, the honey locust, as being anachronistic, and they've lost their beneficial counterparts. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to move on here. All right. So one of the things that I also want to focus on is that word keystone, because many plants are keystone species as well. And we don't think of the plants maybe as the keystone species. We tend to go to the animal, or maybe it's a bird that we say is the keystone species. But I want you to think a little bit about keystone species, and I want you to focus on kind of the plant relationship, which is as important, because without that, this keystone species wouldn't be in existence. So sometimes we don't give the plants the credit they should have when we look at that word keystone. In some instances we do, but with our friend when I look this fellow up, it's always called the American beaver, but we'll call it the Canadian beaver. All right. And away we go. So what we need to ask ourselves is, what plant species kind of rely on that beaver to make this beaver pond? And what plants are benefiting from this? I don't think it's the spruce in the background here. It's got to be something else. And so let's kind of look at what that is. And really, it's the alder. So without the beaver, I don't think our alders are going to be as successful. I'm going to say maybe there's an example. I know that when we hike in our Rockies or the Kootenays, or some of the other beautiful mountain ranges that we have in the western parts of Canada, we definitely have alder, that subspecies tenuifolia. When you see an avalanche slide, an old avalanche slide is as evident as the nose on our faces, because the alders are growing like 10, 20 feet high in these old avalanche slides. So there's a relationship between avalanches and the western alnus in Canada, definitely. But on the east side of our equation, where we don't have those types of avalanches, our subspecies rugosa is super key. And that's wrong here. That should say Ulmus rubra. So I see a mistake right there. Ulmus rugosa in Canada, rugosa is eastern. Our narrow-leafed alder is in the mountains, and that should say Ulmus rubra. Okay, and that's a tree on our west coast. So we'll fix that, but not right now. Okay, so we are on the east side of the equation here, and we see our speckled alder. So without the beaver ponds, we wouldn't have as much speckled alder, and there's a ton of it when we go into those habitats. Definitely, it's really the thickets that grow on the shores of these beaver ponds, and a little bit slightly inland, but often they kind of dissipate as we get away from that water's edge. And so we need that beaver, but it needs the alder. And so there's some very interesting statistics about that. And alder, is a very good northern species. It's a pioneer species. It needs open land in order to do well. And that alder, is always available to produce these strobiles, so that seed's always disseminating with the wind as the strobile matures and opens up. So it moves itself around very easy. It's wind pollinated, more so than insect pollinated. So pioneer species, good in open land with wind, and away we go. And so lots of pollination in the spring, lots of seeds being produced, and we have it growing on the edge of habitats like this. And it needs to have open, wet, marginal sites. And that sounds like a beaver meadow, and that's perfect for that. So what we need to realize is that what we see here is a beaver dam, and in many cases, over 50% of that beaver dam is going to be speckled alder. Spruce is going to be used as well. Some birch is going to be used. But really, I'm not saying it's close to 60%, but it's around 55, 60% when they pull them apart and look at the species. So it's the key component of what makes a beaver dam. It's the key component of what makes the den in the middle of the pond. And it's one of the key contributors to winter browsing when that material is stored underneath of the lodge and then eaten throughout the winter. So poplars are important, alders are important. Those are the important food sources. And then, like we said, alders are a preferred branch to be used in beaver dams. So I found some good statistics in Algonquin Park over here. And what we looked at here, or what they looked at, is this is the number of stems that we used in dams as compared to what they used as a food source. We're saying it's important food source, but it really is important for their dam building for whatever reason. They figured that out. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing is when we look at how many stems are felled in that area that they're studying, 50% basically are speckled alder. So that's an important food source for that beaver. Therefore, when we say the beaver is a keystone species, really what we need to say is the alder is a keystone species. So, because the beaver uses it all the time. And so we definitely know that both of them are keystone species. They rely on each other. It's a good mutual relationship. And they, in turn, then provide the ecosystems for many other things. And that's a pretty short list of other things that rely on these two entities for their habitat. So that's a pretty tiny list. The list is a lot bigger than that, but that's kind of neat. So what we need to say is there are two keystone species in this relationship: member number one over here, and member number one carrying member number two over here. And that's a good place for us to stay grounded that way and give the plant the attention that it needs, because the alders don't get a lot of attention by all of us. And so that's important thing. So we're going to look at this relationship that poplars have as well. And we know that poplars, really are from coast to coast and top to bottom right into Mexico. And they take up a vast area of our total landmass. And so who are the partners that we're talking about? And we can see the partners in here. We can see the poplars easily in yellow and fall color. And we can see something in green. And we can definitely see that, okay, this is a mountain scene, but we need to get a little further into Ontario. We need to get north of Barrie, and we can start to see this relationship much stronger than it is here in southwestern Ontario. It's the same relationship. And really what we need is a mutual partner. And the mutual partner is burning ferociously here. I'm not sure it's burning happily, but in a way, others that are surrounding this fire area are happy that they're burning. And so both partners in crime burn like crazy. And the plants that are outside the boundaries of these colossal fires are happy. And they're going to build a mutual relationship once more. And really, we're looking at spruce, whether it's black spruce, Engelmann spruce, white spruce. Those are the key spruce species. Pretty well red spruce out in the eastern provinces as well. So maybe there's 4 spruce that are really growing in amongst poplars like crazy. Both of them are super flammable, and both are willing counterparts to assist each other in the future generations. So if they both burn, we create massive open areas, and they need open areas to start that next part of their journey. The next generation has to have those open areas, and they grow fast. So these are poplars, the fire moved through there pretty quickly. But what we see is spruce coming up like crazy in amongst these poplars. So that's pretty incredible, that ability to reestablish fast, both of them fast. The spruce often are, well, the spruce not often, the spruce are coming up from seed that blow in. We just did a seed workshop just on Monday. It was a great seed workshop. Two young ladies did a great job. And So we had some students, myself, I took the course, and we looked at white spruce in particular. And it's a pretty short window for collecting white spruce. Once the cones are brown and open, it's too late. That seed has already been disseminated, and the scales have opened, and the wind has moved those seeds. And those cones are perfectly timed for our fire season. And we are in fire season, and we have been. And during that fire season, even though the cones may not be brown, they're ripening, and they ripen quickly. They go from kind of green to brown, like not overnight, but within a few weeks, and out come those seeds. So everything's really well timed for fire season, which, you know, is we're in the thick of things right now. And so, you know, here we got these are poplars coming up. They come up from their roots, and the seeds from the spruce come in from the sideline, so to speak. And away we go. So they can go quick from green to brown really fast on these spruce. And they start to grow up together. And what we have is we have the poplars become the nurse trees. They provide the shade, the shelter, even though we think poplars need full sun, but they need kind of a nurse crop, and it's the spruce that are providing that nurse crop. And over time, though, the spruce are going to take over and shade out those poplars. And then what we're waiting for again is we're waiting for those fires. And so, you know, there was kind of an interesting quote that I saw, and, you know, it may not be appropriate to think about, because there's a lot of people who are really, you know, in peril with these colossal fires, not just in Ontario, but across Canada. But the quote was this, I'm just going to repeat that quote. It's the best way to start a new spruce forest is to get out of the way. It's kind of an interesting kind of, you know, harsh look at reality. And we had that thousands of years ago, and, you know, it's maybe not possible today because of, you know, how we've gone into those locations and inhabited those locations. So it's a very different equation now. So that's, you know, but that's an interesting quote, and it kind of puts it in perspective. And we can see that relationship. This is in Ontario, by the way, this photograph, and we can see that relationship extremely clearly between that spruce and those poplars pretty well, you know, until we can't see over the next crest of these, you know, low mountain ranges. All right, so let's get into kind of a partnership here. We're going to talk about birds. We're going to talk about a couple of pines here. And the first one we want to talk about is our white-barked pine and its associated member. And so there's only 5 stone pines globally, and this is the only stone pine that we have. And most of the other stone pines are, we do have one in Europe, and then I think we have 3 in Asia. And in that book, The Tiger, that I was mentioning, the Korean pine, which is a stone pine, is fundamental for the tiger survival, but the tiger doesn't eat the pine nuts. I'll let you read for the rest of that story. That's an interesting story, but there's a good mutual relationship between the 3 of those entities, and a stone pine is involved in that story. So what we need is to look at the white-barked pine, and it's in peril actually in Canada and other parts of the United States where it's native to. And when we look at oldest things, you know, when we look at the age of things, we have members that are up there, you know, in the top 20 of the oldest things on our planet. And that 16th oldest living thing, I think, was 1,275 years old. It takes a long time for this thing to start to even produce a little bit of a crop. And certainly it takes even longer time for it to produce a significant crop. And we find them in groups and clusters and groves when we do find them. And, you know, I've had the opportunity to have a guided hike, and specifically we're looking for these. And, you know, when you come upon them, it's pretty incredible. And, you know, right on cue, the mutual partner is right there that you can see. And so these stone pines, you know, those scales aren't going to open. Those scales are going to disintegrate, actually. They're pretty soft. You and I could tear them apart. And they're not really that sticky, you know, like with pine resin, but inside of those hard stone pines, the pine nuts themselves. And right on cue, when we got right to our first the group of our friends, the white-barked pine, right in there were several of these Clark's nutcracker. And that bird just lives not just amongst those, because it moves into another species of pine as well. But these are critical, and they're smart, They got a very specialized pouch. They can hold, upwards of, I'm not saying 100 seeds, but 60 to, 70, 80 seeds in a flight, and they do fly. And they are communal. So several nutcrackers get together. They know exactly where they want to set out their seeds for the winter time, and they're very good gatherers, and off they go. And they put them on those nice open sites where the wind can continually sweep that snow off and expose those seeds for them throughout that winter period. So they're busy, and they're waiting for these and one other pine to kind of come onto a ripening stage, and then off they go. And so they're relying on each other, and they'll build a very large communal cache that is used by other things too. So in this case, the bird is looked at as a keystone species, but its partner that should be looked at as a keystone species is the whitebark pine, because it's the two of them that are mutually dependent on each other, and that in turn allows other things to live off their communal well-being. So I'd say it's important to look at that keystone, again, relationship as a species partnership when it's related to the keystone idea, because other things are feeding off their beautiful, their beneficial cohabitation and interactions. And the other partner out there is the stellar jay, and a bit more of a loner, but very important as well. It does kind of the same thing. It's going after those seeds. It buries its seeds though, and it's very protective. It doesn't kind of work with other birds to do that. And it's also a part of that keystone relationship that we were talking about. So it's kind of the threesome, the three musketeers doing their magic. But the other pine that they all work together on is the limber pine. And again, it's kind of a very upper latitude species. And the stellar jay and the Clark's nutcracker, along with a little ground squirrel, the mountain ground squirrel, that it's the threesome that are working to help that thing out. But this pine, it's interesting. It would prefer the birds to do the moving rather than the squirrel. So what that limber pine is doing is it's producing a cone that's super high in resin, like very irritatingly resinous. So we have limber pine at school. You don't want to touch them. They're heavy duty. By having a very high resin count, you keep your scales closed, you fully ripen your seeds, then you quickly open them, and hopefully it's the birds doing some eating, but more importantly, the birds are very good at stashing, where that squirrel is more interested in eating. I'm not saying eating everything on the spot, but it wants to eat. So by really taking care of how it produces its cone and very quickly ripening and opening, that's important. Once it ripens and it opens, so it's maturing over a long period of time, but then it opens quickly. And that's important for that to happen, and that is beneficial to the two birds. So again, we need those, especially our nutcracker, to put that into those caches, those communal groups, and that's often why we can, find them kind of in this type of location. And they've got good memory. They do come back to eat, but they don't get everything, and that's beneficial for the next generation. There's an interesting article right down here that you can, look at, and that's kind of a sad story. And we're really looking at the populations of, especially the nutcracker and the two species of pine. It's not in good shape. Climate change is part of that insect infestation, and a fungal disease is kind of beating that up. So, especially the Clark's nutcracker, it's not going to do well in its perpetuation. So those are some long stories, and now we're kind of getting into some short stories, and we're kind of move forward into the back end of our presentation. And we can think of lots of plants that have relationships, especially with birds. That's kind of an easy one. But I've just kind of focused on a few interesting ones, and then we'll leave it at that. So our Canada yew, if you're fortunate enough to see a stand of Canada yew, it's really about knee height. It really likes maturing forests, like a nice. Often we need to see some hemlock, which is kind of at the maturing end of our our forest. In that, we'll usually find yellow birch, we'll find beech, and we'll find most likely an association of maple, whether it's sugar or whether it's red maple. And we're going to find, a good shady, a good shady situation, and all those plants are going to provide that overstory. This taxus is a bit unique. So just a little bit of facts about this taxus here, Taxus canadensis. It's monoecious when other taxus are dioecious. So because it's monoecious and it's self-pollinating, that's not really conducive for massive seed set. So it produces a fairly low amount of seed as compared to other taxus. So what it does in exchange for that, it layers like crazy. So it's always expanding its territory by layering and moving outwards on its edges through its layering system. The other thing that it does very nicely is it has a slow ripening period. That's important because it wants to keep something coming back, and that's its partner in crime over the season. So the other thing is its seeds are nasty. If you ever tried to propagate taxus, you know that you need to have an acid bath, you need sandpaper to give it that scarification, and you need patience because it's 2 years to break the stratification part of its dormancy. So not only scarification, but 2 years of stratification. So patience. So we need something to work on these seeds right here to at least work on the scarification part of things. And that's going to be our partner in crime. So it needs to be relying on somebody. And there's our counterpart, really. The main counterpart is our spruce grouse. Spruce grouse, I just saw one on Manitoulin Island, actually. And it was sitting in a tree. Grouse are usually kind of a ground animal. And I just happened to look over and it was pretty quiet, but I saw it sitting in its favorite tree, which is not the yew. It likes balsam fir. That's its favorite food source and its favorite hangout. It hangs around on the ground. It eats insects. It eats different fungal entities. It eats seeds, but it definitely likes the aril of the taxus. So that pulpy fruit is good. The seed, it's just ingesting the seed. It really doesn't process the seed. And what it's doing really, it's going to poop out that seed. And when it's going to do that, that's going to be of the benefit because it's already scarified that seed. It's got, grit and stuff in its stomach, and that's going to help it also to process. So even though it eats mostly balsam fir and spruce buds, that's why it's called the spruce grouse, it likes taxus. And so that association is always in place. And that's that asynchronous ripening. We can see fruit that's really very immature right next to ripening fruit. So long fruiting season, very good for that relationship. The next example is our black tupelo, our Nyssa. And that's a flag tree. So we see a lot of migrating birds that are coming in right now. And we know that Nyssa usually grabs fall color quite early as compared to other entities. And that's going to be like, a big light beacon to come on down. And those migratory, especially small songbirds, are going to just do that. They know that signal. They know that tree. And what we're going to have is we're going to have that relationship between migratory birds, fall color, perfectly matched in timing with its maturation of that fruit. And so there's a nice relationship with many types of birds, but still a mutual relationship between feathered friends, migratory feathered friends, and our Nyssa. And that's going to help to move that around. That seed's not going to stay in the bird forever. In a couple of weeks, I am going to talk a little bit about plant distribution, and then I'm going to kind of counter that statement, but we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. We're going to look at poison ivy. We don't think of poison ivy as needing a symbiotic relationship, but it's the birds as well. And one of the big important birds is woodpeckers, actually. So whether it's a pileated woodpecker, the downy woodpecker, they're all important, and they all like poison ivy seeds, and they eat a lot of them, actually. So it's not just the woodpeckers, all right? You can see a cardinal eating poison ivy right here. So these birds are all pretty hardy birds, right? And, there's some warblers that eat poison ivy as well. And they help that plant, with its tasty fruit to move into different parts of the world. So poison ivy is no different than viburnums. The idea of nice, tasty, colorful fruit that entices, obviously, that mutual counterpart in that bird. So, this waxwing is doing its magic on viburnums, and that's going to definitely help that viburnum. An interesting fact about fruit that we see late in the fall, but especially through the winter, it's usually hasn't maximized its brick or its sugar, contents, its bricks when we measure that sugar content. And often we need those, just like grapes, when we look at ice wine and we collect those grapes after that frost, we need that frost for the tree and the plant to concentrate its sugars. And often that's when those fruit then are being consumed by those birds that aren't migratory. So next time you see kind of some fruit in the middle of the winter, you have to think a little bit about, why is it not being eaten? It will be consumed, but maybe it's not just as tasty as it could be, or there's the content and the value of its nutritional package isn't where it needs to be, and a little bit of time and away we go. So whether it's an oriole and a mulberry, or whether it's a woodpecker and poison ivy, we definitely have that. That's a really easy example of mutualism that we can kind of go to. We need to really look at, members of the Juglandaceae family and members of the Fagaceae family. And we need to look at the oaks. We need to look at the hickories, and we need to look at walnuts. And that is one high protein food source. And those trees, have the same strategy. Let's build a super tasty, high protein seed. Let's produce a lot of them at times. Let's kind of go through a masting period where we can really, pull our numbers together and build a tremendous food source. And yes, we're going to be consumed by some furry friends and some birds, but we're going to be buried. And that's very good. So we're going to hide them or bury those seeds, and away we go. They're not going to remember where they all are, definitely. So whether it's oaks, the hickories, or the walnuts, they've got these associated partners. And in that book, that heavy duty American frontier book, it finally gets to the back end, and it really talks about the importance of, these squirrels and birds and the movement of oaks. And that book really has to do with kind of movement of plants in North America over a long period of time, like many, many years. So it does really kind of get into that, but there's lots of information you can find on masting and squirrel population and all those types of things. So whether it's the gray squirrel, eastern gray squirrel, whether it's our little buddy, a harder working squirrel, in my opinion, very full of a lot of vim and vigor, whether it's that northern red squirrel, whether it's a hickory, or whether it's a walnut, they're all important players. And we need to just remember, that blue jay is just as important, and it moves a lot of acorn seeds around, more than hickories. It's pretty big fruit to put into a mouth of a bird, but it certainly is moving those around, and it stashes these, and it protects its little cache, and it eats them all winter long. So if there's a hole in a tree, it's a fight for who is going to be successful in that hole, definitely. And so really what we need to realize is, the black walnut is going to meet the squirrel, and that only means one thing: good times for the plant. So the plant's got that figured out. And if you ever look at a squirrel in September, and if you can find that same squirrel in December, they look very different. And in December, they're very chubby, and they're full of high oil protein, and they've buried a lot of high oil and protein for the rest of the winter. And there's been some interesting studies done on gray squirrels and their memory. We think they don't really remember where they hide a lot of their acorns, but they remember a high percentage of them, very high. So they do get quite a few of them, but they leave some, and that's a good thing. But then when we look at a fruit, of this unfortunate demise of the American chestnut, when we find one and we can see their fruit, whether it's the Chinese or Spanish chestnut that we can still find quite a bit of, you can see why that's got to have one protected seed, because those furry friends are really after that high protein. So whether it's beech trees, whether it's the American chestnut, you know, we need to have that relationship. And that little fellow over here, if this is September, it's got to do a lot of eating. So we're going to cheer it along, but it'll be good for that tree as well. All right, so maples rely on those same creatures. Ash rely on those same creatures. We don't have any wing nuts. Sometimes we grow wing nuts here, but we don't have any native wing nuts. And when we get into other parts of the world, everything in that Fagaceae family is key. And that's just a very short additional list of what's in that Fagaceae family, which contains the beeches and our friends, the oaks. And that's part of that equation. And our castanhas, or true chestnuts as well. If we look at things, you know, that might be cute and furry, like our raccoon, along with its counterpart, the bears, and foxes, they do have one thing in common besides being furry and somewhat cute. They've got scat. And when you look at that scat, it's always got unprocessed seeds in there that aren't properly digested, but they've gone through the track of that animal. That's very healthy. They've got a good organic nutritional source ready to go. And they're definitely roaming around, and they're, you know, leaving that scat all over the place. So that is simple. Tasty fruit, colorful fruit, high sugar content, and we're going to have these entities coming in and very easily building that nice mutual relationship, and away we go. We have a symbiotic partnership there that's beneficial to both. So just as we kind of are finishing off here, I want us to think a little bit about, you know, insects, and there's lots of examples, but I've kind of just focused a little bit on our friends, the ants here. And this is the seed of a bloodroot, which, you know, is a plant that we can find as a native plant. And that plant, you know, over time has built mechanisms for dispersal into its fruit, but more importantly, into its seed. And we can see here that that ant is very interested in that seed. And that seed, in essence, has a handle on it. And that handle is full of lipids, sugar, and very high protein. The handle has a name, and that name is kind of difficult to pronounce. And I practiced a bit, but I won't get it right. But what we want is we want that handle to assist the ant in moving that seed. And that seed's going to be moved to the nest of the ant. And ants do build, as a communal insect, they have stashes as well. So they may not just have one nest as a colony, they may have a few nests, and they do move these seeds to the nest. Once that handle has been eaten, that seed is in the way, and that seed is tossed out, and that's good for that seed. So that's how that seed wants to move around. And so there's that word. And that's a toughie. So I'm going to leave it with you to practice that word, and you will go from there. And you can see this is a silphium. And that silphium is the same idea as the bloodroot. So it's got, you know, that handle, so to speak. And that handle has another name. And that's an interesting thing. So what we want is we want that ant to eat that handle. And the handle is that word. So it's elasomes, and they're digested. And you can kind of see what their content is going to be. And then that seed is a byproduct. So out it goes, and that benefits, you know, both that plant and that ant. So that's kind of a very neat mutual relationship that perhaps we're not aware of, you know, as we're looking at our forest floor, you know, where we find some of these plants. And we, you know, we don't really notice the ants so much in that entity. So when we are kind of, you know, thinking about that, and we're kind of just doing a conclusion right now, what we need to realize is that I can use that word symbiotic relationship, or those words symbiotic relationship, the word symbiosis. And we can certainly think of it pretty easily and pretty simply every time we see a flower, right? And we see a pollinating insect, and there's lots of that going on in our gardens all the time. What we need to do, though, is, sometimes that relationship isn't good. It is predaceous. And we do have a predatory entity that's consuming that plant. But what we need to kind of think about a little bit more is that in whatever that relationship is, we need to think about, is there a benefactor here? In some cases it's one-sided, but when it comes to pollination, that's a nice, easy, simple, rosy and cozy thing. That's beneficial to both. And we know that those plants have lots of mechanisms to bring in those pollinators, whether it's a really nice fragrance, whether it's a color, whether it's a contrasting color, whether it's a pattern, or whether it's a structure or a feature that brings in, let's say it's a hummingbird as an example. So there's lots of those types of ideas where we have that very simple idea of mutualism. But there's always an interesting story there, and that's important for us to kind of look at that. And in all those examples, there's definitely two pieces of the puzzle, and we need to kind of look at how that puzzle fits together and kind of get a clear picture of that. And that's where the interest really is kind of looking at that. So really just, in conclusion, those anachronistic species that rely on a partner, they're thanking you for your participation and learning about them. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And I've learned a lot, and I hope that you have learned a lot.
I think we're going to move to our questions now. I'm sure that Harriet is going to be starting. That was great, Darrell, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So just thank you very much, Darrell. That was certainly a really interesting presentation, and I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So just to get into the questions, to begin with, we've got just a comment from Monica McLaren to everyone, which is congratulations, Darrell. So she's, I guess, congratulating you on doing this presentation.
Okay, thanks.
All right. And then following that, Angela Lawrence to host and panelist. This was at the beginning of the presentation, and it's really more of a comment. She says, she makes the point, she says, just like beech bark disease. So I'm not sure exactly what the comment was relating to, but it was at the very beginning of your presentation. I don't know whether you can really comment on that. So I apologize.
Well, the beech bark disease, if I think about it, and I may be incorrect, and so you're welcome to comment further. But to me, that I'm not sure if that would be a symbiotic relationship, and maybe the question is not referring to that, because I don't see it being as a two-sided, and there's two benefactors there. So I really think the beech bark fungal entity is benefiting. And in a way, though, the beech bark disease, it has three players in it, right? So it has the beech tree, which is not benefiting at all. It has a scale, which is feeding off the tree. That then does open up the opportunity for the fungus to enter that bark. So maybe the relationship there really is, there is a twofold relationship. But I'm not sure if the scale is benefiting, but the fungus entering the tree. So I'd have to think about that a little bit. And I haven't maybe clarified that. I don't have it clear in my mind, so I really haven't provided a clear answer.
I think that's actually the question that she was trying to ask. So
okay, all right.
Provided an answer. And then she says afterwards, how do the foxes benefit from the deer pawing the ground?
Oh, so what they're doing is the caribou, the northern caribou, our reindeer, are moving snow is really what they're trying to do. And they're right down to barren rock, and there's not a lot for them to eat, and they're eating that lichen.
Ah,
In amongst that barren rock, like I said, if there's good snow cover, even though it's cold up there, we can have unfrozen ground. We had a student that lived in Labrador, in the northern part of Labrador, and that person was growing all kinds of plants. And they had, like, when I say snow cover, it was incredible, the depth of the snow cover. And all their plants survived. It's not frozen under that snow, because if it was frozen ground, those plants would only have an ability to sustain themselves for a certain temperature range. So that caribou's clawing away, and while it's doing that, there were a lot of small mice, in essence, very small little mammals, and that fox is going after those. And that just helps the fox, it doesn't have to dig through that snow, and that caribou is just, disturbing that soil, and those little entities are kind of also disturbed, and that's what is beneficial to the fox.
okay.
So they're always following the caribou herds, those fox, the Arctic fox. They definitely are. And
Okay.
if we can capture something else along the way, good for them. But that's why they're following the caribou herds.
Okay. Right. So I think moving on, further on in the presentation, this is when you were talking about poplars and so on.
Yes.
So Colleen Viskoff asks, do you mean the poplars are the nurse trees first, then the spruce? So that was, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and just a second here. I'm just going to calm everybody down here. Just a second.
Darrell has some dachshunds apparently.
Yes. And they have opinions, I guess.
I guess.
My grandkids and my wife are coming back from a soccer game, so that won't calm down until the door actually opens. So, okay. So try that question again, please.
Okay, so do you mean the poplars are the nurse trees first, then the spruce?
The poplars are a nurse tree for the spruce. The spruce are going to benefit. The poplars come back very quickly from root suckers. So those poplars are extremely clonal. And those ramets, which is the name for the clonal, and for that clonal group, it's called a ramet on the poplars. When a fire burns through there, the poplar roots are fine. And the poplars are going to come up super quick as suckers. So they're already going to be growing, let's say several inches, if not a few feet. The seeds are going to be blowing in from the spruce, whatever spruce it might be, from the peripheral edges of where the fire didn't burn. And the wind's going to push those seeds into that area. That seed is going to take a while to germinate. So that allows that poplar to grow even a little bit taller. So now we have, young saplings of the poplar, and at the ground level, we've got spruce that are germinating and starting to become small spruce. So the poplars are shading those spruce, kind of like ryegrass shading Kentucky bluegrass, kind of the same relationship.
Right.
And that spruce is going to be delayed in germinating. And eventually, though, both are going to grow mutually together, but those spruce are going to out-compete and shade out those eventually. That poplar forest becomes more predominantly a spruce forest over time. And that time may be, when I say 100 years, I might say 100 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Claudette makes the point with regard to the spruce and poplar burning, they are already, sorry, just a moment. They are all, oops. Just have to move something back here. All right. Sorry about this.
Can you find it, Harriet? Do you want me to read it?
Yep, I got it. So with regard to the spruce and poplar burning, they are already growing so close. So what is the purpose of the fire? Just to restart the forest and get rid of plants or pests in the understory? So that's the question.
I think those both are what are called fire dependent species. And there's other fire dependent species, but poplars and spruce, more so than pines. Pines like a different type of fire. Pines would prefer a ground fire, which is, just at the surface, fast moving, kind of like an oak savanna, Spruce and poplars are much more of a true fire dependent species. They are highly flammable. They contain a lot of volatile oils. And when a fire happens, it's going to be colossal. So a crown fire, like we're seeing, images of all the time on television. And those crown fires are hot, they're severe, and they're devastating. But that creates the bedding material for the spruce to germinate in, and it creates that openness and an open environment for all those young trees to take off like crazy. Plus, it's recycling of all the nutrients. So we have ash, which is super, high in nutrition. So those fire-dependent species, they need a frequency of fire that may be several decades in length. Maybe, that they can tell through older trees what the frequency of fire. And sometimes those colossal fires may be up to 400 years apart. Maybe sometimes 100 years, maybe 50. But there's been some great big significant periods of time before the next colossal fire moves forward. But that's not going to be a poplar and a spruce forest, because those are pioneer species. They need more frequent fires to happen. When I say every 50, I'm just making some numbers up, but I won't be too far off. But they would prefer a fire every maybe 50 to 100 years. Where other species, like Thuya plicata and those temperate rainforests of British Columbia, the frequency of fire, big colossal fires, is going to be much greater, several centuries. But that's a different type of tree. That is a climax tree. But a poplar and a spruce are not climax trees. So they need fire to create the conditions for the next generation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So next question is, why is a stone pine called as such?
I think just because that pine seed is hard. Like if you take a pine seed and you try to crush it in your teeth, you got to be careful. You're going to the dentist for some crown work. So it's like a stone, definitely. Yes.
And then Anja Lowens again makes the comment, squirrels have planted many peanuts in my yard.
Yes, they have. Yeah.
As well. Janet McKay also makes a comment. I think last year must have been a good year for birds around Burlington. There's a lot of poison ivy on RBG nature trails. So that's further on in the presentation. We're talking about poison ivy.
Oh yeah, it's sometimes hard to think about what moves it, but the birds are there. The birds are doing their magic and doing exactly what the poison ivy wants them to do.
All right. And again, Claudette, it's hard to convince the public sometimes that poison ivy has a place in the environment. So
I think it is a good comment, right? So everything has its function and has its purpose, and sometimes we are naive as to what that function and purpose is, and that happens a lot. One thing I wanted to say is, I tried to kind of focus definitely on just material that is within Canada for sure. But there's some, just incredible stories globally when it comes to plant relationships. And sometimes the harsher the environment, the more interesting the story becomes. So, I've done a lot of reading. And just, when it comes to a desert environment, or when it comes to, plants in Australia, certainly plants down in the deserts of the United States and Mexico, the relationships, it's kind of dog eat dog down there in harsh conditions. But the stories really of mutual relationships are, and I say more fascinating, they're more diverse, because it's an unknown entity, for myself, as if I'm reading about it, and I kind of find that stuff really fascinating. So there's lots of information out there once you really just open the page and away you go. Yeah, you could spend a lifetime reading and learning, definitely.
All right. And this is a question from me, actually. You were talking about gray squirrels and the fact that they have a good memory for finding their nuts. There was something to that effect. And my question was, I thought that it was their sense of smell that allowed them to find their nuts, throughout the year.
I'm going to contribute that bit of knowledge to a person that visits the botanical gardens pretty well daily with a bag of peanuts.
Oh,
And the squirrels know exactly what time of day it is, and it's pretty amazing. So, and they come fast and furious. But the fox learned about that as well, and for a while the fox was doing very good on a daily basis. But the fox is no longer coming around for whatever reason. But that person knows a lot about squirrels, and so they said something to me about squirrel memory, and I thought, nah, I'm not sure about that. So I did some reading about that, and there's lots of interesting ways that they can look at information and do experimental work and learn learn at behavior and learn from that behavior. And so it has a lot to do with triangulation, surprisingly. And I read through some of those experiments and so forth, that the squirrels have a very good ability when they bury a nut to triangulate its position. That's actually not the right word. The word triangulation is often misused. It's trilateration when we use 3 points. So trilateration, they use trilateration, and they seem to be able to remember that location through trilateration. I'm not saying they're not using their sense of smell, but they're using more senses than we realize.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. So my final question here is that a European walnut and also a British red squirrel, I guess, in one of your slides?
Yeah, I would say it's mostly a Persian walnut, and that's it is a European squirrel. Yeah, it's a bit more tufty looking.
Okay.
Yeah. That was good catch. Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
So that's it for my questions. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Trish, and if more questions have come in, then she will pose them to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Harriet. I just want to comment first on the comments. There were several comments, Darrell. Very enjoyable. Thank you. So unique. People would like to go back to school and learn more about the topic. You've inspired some people in that way. Thank you also for the list of books. Terrific presentation. It reminded me that there are many types of symbiotic relationships. Somebody else said, thanks, Darrell. Going to be lots of new growth spruce poplar growing in my region. NWO this year, Northwestern Ontario, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a current fire map that I looked at just today, and just realized, the fires that are ongoing. And then, when you zoomed in, there was different demarcations for brand new fires. It's just, we're out of touch here in Southwestern Ontario. We talked about a bit of a smoke smog day, but I've only experienced it once in my life where I was out west, when you realize the enormity of these fires. And I can remember one time driving across the top end of Lake Superior, and I looked, and we were traveling for about 45 minutes. And it was an even-aged forest, off we were driving east, off to the left-hand side. And I thought, this is not from deforestation, mechanically. Deforestation means this was a fire. It was a biggie, and it went on and we were driving at 100 kilometers an hour. So they are enormous, and we are pretty removed from all of that. So it's interesting to think about that and realize, that there are people that are in danger. Definitely.
Yeah, very frightening to be part of that. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so after those comments, there were a few questions. This one was from Claudette. Which animal would be impacted if poison ivy disappeared?
That's a good question. I'm thinking, because it's a pretty big group of birds, there's going to be lots of other things, to feed those birds.
Mhm.
So that is a good question. Sometimes underlying and in a minute way, there's an insect relationship with a plant, right? And so I don't know of any insect relationship with poison ivy. And I think that there's lots of other food sources that, those birds are going to go after. So, and in some instances, just looking at our bird population, some of them are in decline and some are moving forward. And so I'm not really answering that question, but it has to have an impact. There's a lot of poison ivy out there. There's lots of poison ivy, so that's an important food source, definitely.
Okay.
What we're seeing is we're seeing a lot more like robins, which are overwintering in larger numbers all the time. It might be because we're a slightly warmer climate, but a lot of the invasive plants, have really increased in number. So rhamnus, as an example, European buckthorn, is really, when they look at a robin population, that is a key plant that allow the male robins to stay in southwestern Ontario. And I'm not sure how far north we can find that, but we definitely see them here. And so there's an example maybe of an invasive plant that if we got rid of high numbers, it's going to impact. And I know that in the Pinery Provincial Park there was a study, and definitely a committee that were very interested in taking out all the European buckthorn of the pineries, like in one big foul effort, foul swoop. But one of the things that delayed that was overwintering robin populations, and they realized that they would have a big impact. So, that kind of isn't answering the poison ivy question, but it does kind of relate to that, because one plant impacts definitely that species. And I don't know what the outcome of whether they went ahead with that or not. I just read the preliminary kind of strategy report on that, and that was part of that.
Okay, thank you. I do have a few more questions. Do we have time for
Yeah.
all the
Oh yeah.
questions? Is that okay? All
Yes,
right.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Ingrid would like her comment is the forestry companies in BC routinely spray glyphosate on the young aspens to reduce competition with more valuable pine and Douglas fir trees. Is this human interference destroying the mutualism of the species?
That's a good question. I can say this. Just I've had a couple opportunities to do some study tours out there. The amount of regeneration from an area that's been devastated by fire is pretty incredible, if it's untouched and just allowed to do its thing. The amount of lodgepole pine that comes up from barren ground and how fast it comes back up is truly incredible. So, nature, has an interesting way of doing things, and we interfere with that. So by spraying glyphosate, we're interested in our renewable resource, is what we're calling those trees, right? And it's 100-year, maybe 150-year, maybe it's some places it's longer than that, but we're looking at it as a renewable resource, and we're trying to manage that as exactly that. So does it impact that? It mostly allows for those pines to have less competition, which means they're going to grow faster, which is really the intent. And the Douglas fir, and are we taking spruce down in large quantity in BC? I think it's pine and Doug fir that we're very interested in. I'm not saying spruce. And here in Ontario, we take jack pine down, we take black spruce down, and white spruce. So we see definitely a couple more two partners on the spruce side of things and one in the pine. So I think they're just trying to shorten the length of time before we can collect that renewable resource once again. So yeah, I think we are affecting it, and it'll be the consequences may not be known for a while. What type of forest that we're going to create during that period of time. So
We'll wait and see.
It's incredible how many. I'm not saying that they replant about 1 billion trees in British Columbia, but it's not far off. I was just reading something. I think in Ontario we replant about under 300 million trees a year. In BC, a few years ago, it was close to 800 million trees are planted yearly. It's just a mind-blowing number.
Tremendous number,
Yeah,
yeah.
so they need a lot of seedling nurseries to fill
do
that
Yeah,
order, right?
for sure.
So they definitely are trying to focus on a renewable resource, and they're focusing pretty hard on replanting. And I got to give BC, the forestry department there quite a bit of credit. They're pretty. They do a lot of things with purpose, but it's with good thoughts in mind. So you just, if you want to replant a side of a mountain, the seed has to be from that mountain.
Mm.
It doesn't, from mountain A, the seeds do not go to mountain D.
Okay.
And sometimes if they want to replant a north slope, they've got seed collected from that north slope, stored, documented, and ready to go, so that that north slope gets replanted with exactly the same gene pool that came off that north slope. So it's way more intense and way more focused than Ontario's mandate and Ontario's processes. I can say that without hesitation.
Okay.
I was actually kind of floored by the intensity of the reforestation program and the degree of thought that goes into it. I'm not saying it's great, right or wrong what they're doing out there, but that's kind of what they're trying to do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mary Ann is asking, can you explain how species survive when they lose their symbiotic partner?
Well, if let's say it's that yucca and that moth as the example, if it's a one-on-one relationship, and with one gone, it'd be the same story as some of those anachronistic species. In many of the examples I gave you, there's an example would be the pinyon pine. No, more so the white-barked pine and the Clark's nutcracker. If you read about that, it's not good. That plant cannot move fast enough or high enough to get out of the heat, and the heat and is causing parasitism, and it's causing an insect infestation. And look how long it takes before you get a viable seed out of that tree. It's decades. So, and we haven't experienced global warming like we have in British Columbia. I was just talking to my sister. She lives in California. And she said an interesting thing. She said, I was reading a report about what parts of North America haven't really experienced significant or even a moderate global warming. And she said the Great Lakes Basin, and she said the Atlantic coast, and she was reading correctly. So here in Southwestern Ontario, we don't know what global warming is yet, because it's only a degree, half a degree actually, I think is the difference right now. When you go to British Columbia or you go into the northern parts of provinces, there you see what global warming is all about. And so that plant's not going to be able to move fast enough unless it has some human interference. And there's lots of volunteers who are very interested in moving it upwards into more higher altitudes and seeing if we can help that plant move fast. And so that's how you get these anachronistic species when that doesn't happen for whatever reason.
Okay, I think this is the last question. I'll check. I'll give you the question and I'll check the chat. Is there a symbiotic partner that you know for the Wollemi pine in Australia?
I saw that coming up, that question. It popped up on the screen there, and you know what? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. When you look at those monotypic species, and that's a very good example of a really, you can use the word monotypic species at many levels, and you can use it correctly at many levels. I could say that I have a monotypic species at a family level, and ginkgo is an example. So I have just ginkgoaceae. I have one plant in there. That's only one species. That's monotypic at its maximum. The Wollemi pine, would be a monotypic species at the genus level, because there's only one species, but there's other plants in that family. So I say that because I'd have to think a little bit about other members of that family. And that's a good place to start to kind of look at kind of symbiotic relationships. But then at the same time, we'd have to look at geography and how separated it is maybe from other members of that same family. And, in some cases, that partner wouldn't be able to be on that other continent for whatever reason. So I don't know enough about that plant to really answer that question. So it would take some digging and some reading.
A trip to Australia, perhaps.
Yes. So there's a comment here that's come up that's, mycorrhizae have association with Wilhelmina, and that would be most likely, I wouldn't disagree with that because almost, the majority of plants have those relationships. But it'd be kind of fun to see what type of mycorrhizae and what else do they associate with. I was reading an interesting thing about lady slipper, and it needs to have acidic soils. So if we were to try to grow a lady slipper in southwestern Ontario, the majority of our soils are, calcareous limestone-based soils. But it has to do with a mycorrhizae association, very specific with lady slippers, and that mycorrhizae cannot live on anything but acid soils. So, those are the types of really interesting things when you look at those very specific fungal entities and a plant entity, realizing that the ecosystem around both of those has to be maybe very specific. So, and that's has a lot to do when we inoculate newly planted trees with mycorrhizae. It's very temporary.
Thank you very much, Darrell. You've been really generous with your time in answering the questions.
Oh,
And
no problem.
I'm going to pass it over to Claudette.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm just sharing the results of our Dream Garden visit, and it looks like it was split about 30% each for Montedon, Gertrude Jekyll, and Monet's Garden in Giverny. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in that. I think we're passing it over to Kate.
Oh, can you just start my video? Because I can't.
Okay, go ahead, Kate, and we'll see if we can. I can't seem to, but why don't you continue in any case?
Okay, I was just going to thank Darrell for such a
You
wonderful.
can, Kate. You can turn it on now.
Oh, okay, hold on.
There we are.
There we go.
I was just going to thank him for such a super presentation. What a great way to spend a Wednesday night. And we have another one coming up in 2 weeks. So we've got that to look forward to. I also really want to thank Janet and Claudette for their technical expertise. Without them, this would never have happened. I always mess up all of that stuff. Harriet and Trish, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Bev because she's the one who made that amazing poster that went out in the invitation, which that was just a fabulous poster. And if you haven't signed up for next Wednesday, please do so. Chris is going to be talking about he's going to profile some of the pests and diseases that are not in North America yet, but possibly on the horizon. So I think that's also going to be a very interesting evening. So thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thanks for your extra time.
Oh, you're welcome.